everyone. My name is Julie, and I organize webinars for the Claire Booth Luce Center for Conservative Women. I am so happy for you to join us this afternoon with our guest speaker, Katherine Engelberg. Here at the Center, our mission is to prepare women for effective leadership and to promote leading conservative women. Our materials, programs, and initiatives support ideas and efforts that are pro-America, pro-family, and support free enterprise. We encourage our supporters and students to be active ambassadors of conservative philosophy in their schools, workplaces, and communities. If you are interested in learning more about the Center for Conservative Women, I invite you to visit our website, cblwomen.org, and follow us on our social media platforms. Joining me today is one of our center's fall fellows, Gloriana Girapantini. Gloriana is studying media and communications at East Tennessee State University. She has a concentration in advertising and public relations, as well as a minor in digital media. She has served as secretary of the Conservative Coalition at her university. She also has experience in 3D art and has published a Snapchat lens, which received over 425,000 plays. We are very thankful to have her as part of our team this fall.
Katherine Engelbrecht founded True the Vote in 2009. This organization is a citizen-led effort to restore honor and integrity to our electoral system. True the Vote educates voters, trains and mobilizes citizens to work at the polls, researches the veracity of voter rolls, and advocates for election code reform. Katherine believes when government isn't held accountable, it inevitably abuses the rights of American citizens. When she learned the IRS was targeting her organization and others, Katherine took action. In 2013, True the Vote embarked on a precedent-setting lawsuit against the IRS and its top leadership, leading to a historic victory in 2019. She is a nationally recognized spokesperson on voters' rights and free speech, appearing on TV and radio. Katherine has testified before Congress and state legislators and has received many awards for her work. Today, Katherine will speak on a big concern of most Americans, election fraud. Our election process is vulnerable to corruption in many ways. These vulnerabilities are now being exploited by groups who intentionally orchestrate chaos in an attempt to control outcomes. In this webinar, she will talk about what's happening and what you can do about it. Please join me in welcoming Katherine Engelberg.
Hi guys, thanks so much. Can you all hear me okay?
It's a little fuzzy. Can you try again?
Yeah, sure. Let's see. See if there's. Any better?
Yes.
Better? Okay, great. Okay. So thank you all so much for the opportunity. I mean, what extraordinary times we find ourselves in. You know, when I started True the Vote back in 2010, it was really quite by accident. We had heard that there was a need for people to go and work at the polls. And so a small group came together, and this was back when the Tea Party was all just sort of bubbling up. And we knew that, you know, we wanted to be able to do something that felt sustainable and valuable to the overall, you know, good of our community. And so when we learned that there was a volunteer gap, we thought, okay, we can go and do this, and this will be something that we will do one time, and we will have a great experience, and then come back and go do something else. But what happened when we went and worked at the polls that day was that we saw problems. We saw process problems. We saw what could only be considered vote fraud. Let me give you some examples. We saw people who would come in with more than one voter registration card, and this was in Texas, so this was before we had photo voter identification. And they would have two different cards with two different names, and they would present one and be told, oh, well, I'm sorry, you've already voted. And then they would show another one with a different name and be told, oh, well, you can, that's fine, you can go vote. Or people who would come in and kind of whisper, I don't remember who I'm supposed to vote for. And then the judge would take them to the voting booth and vote essentially for them. And these were just a few examples of what people were seeing, what our little group was seeing when we were observing, which made you wonder, well, what happens when nobody's there, when nobody's watching? And that was really what kicked off True the Vote. We thought, you know, we're going to take a closer look. We're going to figure out if there is something to be concerned about. We always hear about dead people voting you know, broad vote fraud, but with not a whole lot of definition around what that really means. So is there something to be concerned about or not? When you think about it, elections should be pretty cut and dry. I mean, you've got a process, you've got rules, and so you can take a lot of the subjectivity out of it. If you come at this from a core, as you know, almost every American does, that you should have an opportunity to participate in the free and fair process, then with that as the cornerstone, the process sort of weaves around the notion of, we're going to make sure that if you are a registered voter, your voice is heard, your voice counts and will be counted. And the reason I say that almost every American believes that is that not everyone does. There are those who exploit the weaknesses in a process that was built upon a supposition of honor. And we're now seeing a lot of those processes played to their full advantage. And so when True the Vote began in 2010, the steps forward were trying to sort of reverse engineer the process. We looked at voter rolls and we began to find problems within the voter rolls. And then we took action and learned about things you can do with what are called citizen challenges, where citizens can request that the counties review voter registrations based upon certain criteria. And we've learned about all the things that election law allowed for citizens to participate in. And our eyes were opened to all the many ways that citizens could serve. And so what True the Vote's program then became was one of citizen empowerment and of trying to figure out every single way that a citizen could serve if they wanted to, and then building programs around that. And so right now, even though we're focused because of where we are 17 days, I think it's 17, 18 days from the election, where we're focused right now is working in the election and sort of bearing witness to what is happening in these extraordinary times, which I'll speak in greater detail about. But it's just one of the things that we do. We recruit, train, and mobilize people to go and work in the polls, but we also do research on the voter rolls to determine what is really happening with the rolls. Are they accurate? Are they inaccurate? And then we take experiences that we're having inside of the polls that are being documented as procedural breakdowns or problems that we're finding in the rolls, and those kinds of efforts documented into empirical evidence go on to help shape legislative reforms. So you can, as a citizen, take what you're learning and then go and talk to your elected representative and say, look, these are the kinds of problems that we're seeing. What in our law needs to be addressed to prevent these problems from occurring in the future? And so the design of True the Vote's program is sort of full cycle. Like you work in the polls, you check the rolls, you identify problems, you take those problems forward to your representatives, you see if you can advocate for, or you participate in the advocacy for reforms of the problems to avoid those problems and to work towards a better process, so that next time you work in the polls, those processes are resolved and you have a better set of voter rolls and records to work with. And the idea is to create this sort of cycle of improvement. You know, along the way, as was mentioned in my bio, we became targeted by then what was the Obama administration. And you know, look, I don't want to get too far down the rabbit hole and why that all happened, but I would suggest to you that it had a lot to do with the fact that we were then, and still are now, the only pro-liberty organization that is totally devoted at a national level, that is totally devoted to this subject of citizen empowerment, to work in the polls and to work in elections. And I think that, you know, while when we were going through it, it just seemed that this targeting that was happening of us with the IRS asking hundreds of questions about our organization, and the series of events that occurred after that with other government agencies getting involved in my personal life, and all of this sort of seeming to come out of nowhere, with the only catalyzing event being that we had started an organization to get citizens involved in elections. Now, with the benefit of time, I can look back and I can recognize why an organization that empowers citizens to ask questions could be very threatening in an environment where the long-held standard is, if you don't want to know the answers, don't ask the questions. Don't just continue to state what seems to be an intellectually dishonest position, which is, oh, there is no voter fraud, there's no problem. And the irony of that approach is clear in the current environment, where even now there's a leftist contingent that will say, well, there's no such thing as vote fraud. Where's the problem? But yet it is clear that there is a problem. The headlines are melting with problems that we are having in this cycle. And so what I'd like to focus on today is how we got to where we got to, and then talk a little bit about where we go from here and how you can be involved. And by the way, ladies, happy 100th anniversary of the women's right to vote. It really hasn't been, it was really not until until 1965, when the Voting Rights Act was passed, that the grass was cut clean for everyone. We could all go vote. It was an equal opportunity for every American registered to vote. And it was almost at the same time, 1965, that elements began to arise to try to divide us. And we began to see the rise of social agitators like Saul Alinsky, and academia like Francis Fox Piven and Richard Cloward, who began to focus on how to use systemic overwhelm to crater systems intentionally. And that then led to a series of events that inch by inch has pushed us towards where we find ourselves in this moment, where everything seems to hang in the balance of a free and fair process that doesn't feel quite so free and fair. So let me dial it back a little bit, and I want to make sure and leave time for questions. The first thing you want to think about is control the vote. Who controls the count? Who controls, who's holding the wizard behind the curtain, if you will? There have been active efforts, particularly in these past 20 years, to shape who controls the vote. And George Soros, who is notorious in his involvement in elections across the world, set his sights on US elections back in the early 2000s. And in 2006, 2007, launched an effort called the Secretary of State Project, where they openly and for the first time began to back secretaries of state at their own words, saying because they wanted to protect their interests in a photo finish presidential election. And that went on to pay big dividends in 2008, when in Minnesota there was a very hotly contested race between two senatorial candidates, Norm Coleman and Al Franken. And Norm Coleman was the incumbent, Al Franken was running against him, and it was important because that particular Senate win would have put the Democrats into a filibuster-proof setup in the Senate, and they were trying to get the Affordable Care Act passed. And so on election night, rather than having a clear winner, the Al Franken camp began a series of recounts and lawsuits, and that drug on for 8 months. Ultimately, they, and they are quoted as saying, they ultimately found enough votes to win, and that's when the election was called. What's relevant about that is not only that Al Franken went on to win and became that 60th vote necessary to pass the Affordable Care Act. It's really, for today's purpose, more important to think about what we learned through that strategy. The strategy was push until you find enough votes to win. And the lawyer that developed that strategy is a man by the name of Mark Elias. Mark Elias went on to then become, from that starting point, went on to then become Hillary Clinton's lawyer and the lawyer for the Democratic National Committee, and now is the orchestrator of a much broader effort to change our election laws. To date, well, since COVID, since this, let's just call it this season of the pandemic, there have been over 350 election-related lawsuits having to do with what are being postured as necessary election process changes due to COVID. What are these changes? Well, they are pushing universal or unsolicited mass mail ballots, as we've now seen how that has played out. And we can get into that a little bit more as well. But the pushing of universal mail ballots, the removal or reshaping of signature verification standards around mail ballots, which is one of the only checks and balances that exist on a mail ballot, is a signature, but they are working hard in court to remove those standards. The revocation of voter ID is another big pillar that they are fighting for across the country right now. The legalization of unlimited vote harvesting, and the lack of standardization around postmarks and the ability to count ballots after election day and whether or not they have postmarks. These are the kinds of things that are being pushed for in court across the country. And even this morning, you can still read headlines. Here, 18 days out from the election, you can still read headlines that tell you that the election laws are still being changed while we are voting. It's outrageous what's happening, but nonetheless, it's happening. And so where do you go from this? Well, the Secretary of State project is one indication of what happens when you get hyperpartisan involvement in these positions that really require a steady command of election law and standards that help make sure everybody's vote counts. So controlling that process is one way to subvert it. And that's, you know, we find ourselves in this environment, like I said, where the media is quick to say, oh, there's no such thing as election fraud. But controlling this process in an unfair way is clearly a type of election fraud that has been baked into the system. And in that way, the fraud has been institutionalized. Another example of election fraud and what has happened broadly is the dilution of the integrity of the ballot itself. How does that occur? By having errant or faulty voter rolls. Voter rolls should be the ultimate safeguard of identity, residency, and citizenship of those registered voters. However, you see routinely lawsuits filed against states to prevent them from cleaning their voter rolls, to prevent them. In fact, they use the term in the age-old game of controlling the wording, controlling the narrative. They call it purging. I mean, in what context does purging sound like something you'd want to be a part of? So they've defined this as purging the voter rolls. In other words, cleaning the voter rolls, making sure that they're accurate. Just one little quick factoid. 20% of our electorate moves in any 2-year election cycle, 20%. Now think about the fact that even the most clear of standards, which there are not many clear standards about how you're supposed to maintain your voter rolls and clean them, but there's a federal standard that suggests that at least every 6 years, you should, if you've not voted, you should be removed from the voter rolls. States don't even, as a standard, don't even comply with that. And so what's interesting in this environment, in this sort of COVID environment, general election, is that we're seeing the same groups who are suing now to prevent voter ID, to prevent signature standards, to prevent or to force mail-in standards. Those are many of the same groups that were previous to COVID, previous to the pandemic, suing states to prevent them from cleaning their voter rolls. So what does that look like in this environment? Look at the headlines. You're seeing tens of thousands of ballots on a daily basis being reported as going out incorrectly, or you know, pictures just anywhere you look of ballots just being thrown in the, you know, thrown in the trash, or delivered to the wrong address. And of course, there are a lot of layers of problems inside of that, from the Postal Service to, you know, other types of fraud all the way down the line. But the reason that it's happening to begin with is because the rolls are inaccurate, and live ballots have been created that will never reach their intended voter because they can't, because that voter is no longer there. That voter has moved, or they are deceased, or they have been entered twice and they're getting more than one ballot, or they were fictitious to begin with and were never identified inside of the rolls. So we have catalyzed this process by diluting the voter rolls. Now, I use the stats that 20% of our electorate moves every 2 years. Add to that 25% of our elections are decided by less than 2 percentage points. And it really brings into focus that every vote counts, every vote matters. And so when you throw that much confusion, that much margin for error into a system that really does count every vote to determine a winner. I mean, we're not rounding off here. It's whoever gets the most. It matters, and it creates a system in which fraud can occur, and can occur almost without detection, because you're not going to go back and check this typically. And in fact, even if you do, the damage has been done. So the best you can do is look back and say, we don't want that to ever happen again. But understanding how it happened is a much longer process, and one that clearly, as a country, we've not really been willing to engage in, because that's why we find ourselves where we are now. The third piece to consider here is the elimination of competition, the elimination of a fair playing field. What do I mean by that? Well, there is something called the New Jersey Consent Decree, and this is important. In the early 80s, the DNC sued the RNC, so the national level parties. The Democrats sued the Republicans, and they accused them of vote caging and a number of different things that led what they were positioning as vote suppression. And so rather than fighting the suit at the time, the Republican Party settled in a consent decree that was settled in New Jersey, even though it had a national impact. And what they settled for was that they would not engage in ballot security unless getting it first pre-cleared through the courts. Well, that was in the early 80s. And that lawsuit and the extension of that decree continued, even though the Republican Party tried to appeal it over a number of years, again and again. It was continued to be extended, only now expiring in 2017. So this is the first presidential cycle where both parties have had the opportunity to participate in ballot security, whatever that means on both sides. But the Republican Party, even though the New Jersey Consent Decree only mattered at a national level, it certainly had a trickle-down impact, and you saw counties and local community parties, state parties, county parties, that they just sort of were, you know, without leadership in this regard. And it's clear now that the recognition for how to best train and mobilize poll workers, how best to create environments in which ballot security teams work together, that's all very new ground for the Republican Party. And it was intentional on behalf of the Democrats to keep the Republicans out of this process for so long, which clearly just doesn't bode well for the integrity of the overall system, because you have a system based upon the parity of parties, and when you remove one, it just creates an imbalance that doesn't work well. The fourth piece is intentionally overwhelm the process. Now, we have seen this overwhelm again at the hands of Mark Elias and the hundreds of lawsuits that he is helping to strategically place in key areas across the country. We're seeing the overwhelm and the flood of mail ballots. that in and of itself is enough to create a sense of confusion around the overall process, because counties are not equipped to manage this incoming influx of mail. They don't have the sufficient infrastructure to process the mail ballots, to have volunteers there to really have being able to be well trained to do a proper signature comparison, if a signature comparison standard even exists. So the overwhelm, the crush of new standards, new rules, lawsuits, changing processes, changing rules, confusing voters, is very much, as we have seen over time, a play in the playbook of a radical left agenda that wants to, you know, as has been said, you know, never let a crisis go to waste. They will engineer chaos, because in that engineering of it, they then can better control the outcome. Going again all the way back to that Minnesota lawsuit where Al Franken contested over an 8-month period, they are preparing to, on the other side of this election, they are preparing an environment where there will be endless recounts. There will be exponential numbers of Bush v. Gore kinds of contests, because they have created those environments and those imbalances pre-election. They've created legal quagmires that they are going to be able to use as at their discretion on the backside of this election. They've created disparate outcomes between counties and a disparate application of law, and all of those are legally actionable post-election, and they've known that full well. So they created the chaos to use it on the other side of the election. And then the last piece is maybe most troubling, and that is what seems to be happening right now is the setup of an environment that is really using voters not for their individual voice and their individual vote, but rather as pawns and a means to an end that can be a part of sufficient confusion so that post-election there's not certainty as to when enough is enough, when is done, when do we call the winners. You know, there's been, you know, wall-to-wall coverage on the assertion that no matter what the outcome, that Biden should not concede, that Trump should not concede, that, you know, that Nancy Pelosi is ready to remove President Trump from the White House if that's what it takes. This has been playing out for months. They have been telegraphing their position here, that the Democrats intend to take every action necessary to ensure that President Trump doesn't get back into the White House. And the way that plays out strategically, or may play out strategically in this election cycle, is as follows. All elections have to be sealed. The dust has to be settled on any contests in order for, and this is critical, in order for the electors for the Electoral College to be awarded. And so December the 8th is the deadline for the final tally for electors to be awarded to the Electoral College. The electors then meet, and that happens in late December. And then in January 20th to be exact, January 20th at noon to be exact, whichever candidate has been awarded at least 270 electoral votes from the Electoral College will go on to become the president. Now, if that doesn't occur, if neither candidate reaches 270, then the vote for president, or the determination for president, will go to the House of Representatives, and that's what's written into the Constitution. If neither candidate has a 270 electoral count, then the House of Representatives will elect the president from the top 3 vote getters from the Electoral College, and the Senate will decide the vice presidency. Constitution is very, very clear about that. So when you think about the conditions that are being set up, the potential for hundreds or thousands of lawsuits post-election, the time it will take to manage the mail ballot process and get a clear count as the clock ticks towards December the 8th. We can look back at the primary and see states that counted for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks and still hadn't accomplished their final sealed determination of election count or of vote count. You put a jumble of lawsuits together with, a tsunami of mail ballots, and it doesn't bode well for that December 8th deadline. If you want to play the odds of which states have big elector counts that we just need to keep out of the Electoral College altogether, you just bury them in mail and lawsuits. And then they're taken out of the calculation, which pushes, again, towards that House of Representatives type vote. So all to say that the process that we are seeing in play right now has been a long time coming, didn't happen overnight, and it won't be corrected overnight either. As a practical matter, it's highly unlikely that we will know who is going to be our president on the evening of November the 3rd. Could it happen? I pray it does. I hope that none of what I'm talking about comes to pass. But the die has been cast. The lawsuits have been framed. We have seen it pre-election. We know that they have over 1,000 lawyers on retainer, they being the Democrat Party, over 1,000 lawyers on retainer now for post-election recounts and for post-election lawsuits. They are making it very clear what they intend to do. And we need to be aware of the process. Now, when I say we, because I want to be clear about this, I mean the American voter. Voters, writ large, whether you're Republican or Democrat, having power brokers create environments that take the power of your vote away from you and give it to the courts or give it into a process that has been engineered so that your voice isn't heard and rather the Politico voice is heard or the attorney voice is heard more loudly than the American voter. That's a problem. And so what can you ultimately do about it? Well, right now, what you need to be focused on is, first of all, voting. And of course, that sounds obvious, right? Everybody's going to vote. But in the current climate and in the current level of confusion, when you see voters having to stand in line to vote, and it's easy to just kind of shrug your shoulders and say, well, I meant to vote, but what's one vote going to really matter? And it's that sentiment that causes a compounding problem when lots of people share those kinds of notions. Well, maybe if I don't vote, it's probably not going to matter. It matters. So just take that totally off the table. Vote without regard for inconvenience. If you have to wear a mask and a face shield and whatever your state rules are, just go vote. That's the most important. Second most important is vote early. Depending upon what state you're in, you may only have the option of voting by mail. And if that's the only option you have, then take that option. If you have the option to take that mail ballot or take that paper ballot and turn it into a person, either in an early voting environment or at a drop box or a in-person polling place where you can hand someone the mail ballot, that is always going to be preferential, is doing this in person. And then if you have the opportunity to vote early, do that as well. Not as well, but do it as a best practice in advance of November the 3rd. So restated, vote and vote early, whatever way gets you in closest contact with another human being. If it's in-person voting early, or if it's taking your mail ballot in and handing it to someone, those are the preferred methods of voting. But vote early. The great thing about voting early is if you get to the polling place and you do have a problem, and we are hearing of problems. We're hearing lots of equipment failure. We're hearing lots of instances where people get there and are told, well, you already received a mail ballot. And when the voter says, no, I didn't request a mail ballot, I didn't receive a mail ballot, and there are procedural things that have to be done in those instances, don't leave any of that to chance. The more time you have to cure any problem, the better off you're going to be. So vote early. But the other thing that voting early allows you to do is serve. You can serve on election day or into the run-up to the election. How do you get involved? At this point, generally what we tell you is come to True the Vote, sign up. We're going to help you get trained and we're going to help you get mobilized. And while that is true, we are now, in the straightaway. And so what we would say is, please come to True the Vote, sign up. We're going to keep you informed. We have supplemental training. But today, call your preferred party or your preferred candidate locally and let them know that you want to participate in their ballot security program. If you don't get any response, then by gum, get in your car and drive to your party headquarters and just say, put me in. I want to serve. How might you serve? You can be a poll watcher. You can help in signature verification. Again, every state has their own standards, but you can help in signature verification where those opportunities exist. You can help in central count. You can help just in the staffing of helping other volunteers find their position inside the polls. I mean, there's just so many ways. The one thing that is true across the country is there are not enough volunteers. So insert yourself in the process. This is going to be one of those moments in history that we will look back on and we will say, for the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage, where were you in 2020? What was your voting experience? Do not let that answer for you be, I didn't participate, I just watched it roll in on the television. Be involved. This is where the rubber meets the road for civic engagement. And this election, I don't need to tell you, if you're clued in enough to be a part of this webinar, you know we are fighting for the freedom, the continued freedom of this country. We must engage. We must bear witness. We must be able to tell the story of what is happening. And yes, there are problems that have been caused by decades of erosion to a free and fair process. We have to get back to a process that Americans can believe in. We have to get through where we are right now. And then my prayer is in 2021, there will be a rise up of Americans across the country who say, never again can we let that process happen. And we start a conversation, a national conversation about better ways forward. And there are so many ways that our system can be improved. And that means improvement irrespective of political party. When it comes to election integrity, you have to sort of set aside that partisan hat and truly want for the clear vote for all parties involved to be heard. That's the way America is intended to work. That's the beauty of America, is that free and fair process that asks Americans, what do you want for your government? Where do you want things to go? And so there's so many ways to serve. There's so much to be involved in. And right now it seems overwhelming. So the last thing I'll tell you is this. As I've laid out all the reasons or many of the reasons that the fraud has become institutionalized and the challenges that we face, I'll leave you with this. While all those things are true, take all of that and consider it sort of the signal versus the noise. Because the noise, all the process issues, all the backstory, all of it's true. It all adds color to and context to a very broad story. But the fact is, you have to listen now for the signal. And the signal is vote and serve and speak up if you see a problem. Vote and serve and speak up if you see a problem. record it if you see a problem. We're all now, because of these, we're all reporters ourselves. So if you do see a problem, make sure that you record it if you can. Make sure you capture it if you can, but be a part of it. Don't just wait and have this called in on election night and you feel like, oh, well, you know, the band played on. You have a role to play. Your country needs you. And so please, please sign up with True the Vote, join in the process, be a part of this. And, you know, in the end, if our elections aren't truly fair, we are not truly free. And so work together with True the Vote or with your local party or just with one another, forming your own, within your own community of friends, forming election integrity efforts to make sure that your vote counts and is counted. So with that, I thank you so much for the benefit of the time, and we'll take any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much. So extremely informative. We really appreciate that. One question that's coming in is, what is your opinion on a national voter registration database?
It's touchy, right? Because there are concerns that, you know, I don't want there to be a national database of voters. But the reality is, there's a national database for, I mean, how do you think Amazon works? I mean, there are national databases everywhere. The challenge is to create an environment that protects individual privacy and state sovereignty, but respects and understands national security as well. And so there are technologies that would support that. And I think we have to begin asking ourselves, because we live in a very transient society, right? Where people move a lot, there are a lot of changes. How do you best create a condition that allows for states to manage their process, but manage it in concert with other states so that you can create a broad set of accurate roles? A technology that would afford that opportunity is blockchain technology and advancements past blockchain that use distributed ledgers that, but yet anonymize the voter themselves. So there's a lot of opportunity. You know, interestingly, we are the only industrialized country in the world that doesn't have a standard for photo voter identification. We have to have some improvements, and some type of a database that is sovereign to the state, but yet shared for accuracy is something that needs to be on the table.
And since you brought that up, there's so many arguments being made among various leftist groups that claim that voter ID is racist and has all of these negative connotations. Can you talk more about that opinion and how to confront that narrative? Simply because others are doing it, it doesn't seem that that really holds water.
No, I mean the reality is it's just a false argument. It's a false premise. You know, in 2020, if you don't have any form of identification, and frankly, this is a conversation I have with when that objection is brought up to me. If you don't have any form of identification in 2020, you are leading a very limited life with respect to a lot of the modern conveniences that should otherwise be available. And so to have a voter ID, which states provide and will bend over backwards to get to a voter, should be a great thing. It should be a great thing to be able to have an identification source that not only helps you vote, but helps you in everyday modern existence. So in my experience, it is an argument that is not based in truth. It is based in a continued desire to create this narrative around a victimization that just doesn't, when you ask the average voter how they feel about that, or a minority group, which is often, you know, the argument is minorities can't get IDs. What in the world? How rude, how absolutely absurd is that argument? So I just wouldn't accept the premise of it. It's just not factually accurate.
Thank you. Another question we have is, what happened to the Trump task force headed by Chris Kobach on voter fraud? Do you know anything about that?
I do. So I was very hopeful that we would see a commission come together that would have an opportunity to really get to the bottom of some of the problems that I described. And unfortunately, the way that was approached kind of got off to a stutter step, let's just say, because the argument became buying voter rolls, or excuse me, that's incorrect. The argument became demanding that secretaries of state give the commission voter rolls for their review, and then secretaries of state, many of them took a position that, you know, they were going to be the great protector of their voter database and not give it. And it was this very sort of, and lawsuits started piling on. And here's the fact, you can go and, I mean, the voter rolls are public record. You can go and buy them for a nominal fee and dispel with that argument entirely. So I'm not sure why that was the first effort made, but it was ultimately the beginning and the end of the commission, and nothing happened past that, unfortunately. Lawsuits piled up and it just sort of disbanded.
Thank you. Something that I think is on everyone's mind is on this webinar is the current election, and someone would like to know regarding this current election, what you've described is it sounds very negative and fatalistic in a way, but they appreciate your information. But what they're concerned is, how do conservative groups establish a same type of presence as far as, okay, if they're going to be suing afterwards and creating this negativity, how do we do that to counter sue, or what's the best approach? Is there anything that we can do on this election cycle?
Right, and look, I hope that everything I have said with respect to the ominous tone for this cycle, I hope that I am wrong. I would be very glad to become one of the speakers that you guys look back on and go, wow, she was out there. That'd be great. But I don't think that's the case. I think that we have great reason to be concerned. And that's just a reality check. So I'd much rather be honest with you about what I'm seeing than sugarcoat it. What you can do, this is why, and I mean this, I'll speak to this as an individual, and I'll speak to it sort of more strategically. Sorry, you guys, this is the benefit of having Zoom. My cat is going crazy, so she's knocking my computer around. As an individual, I cannot overstate the value of serving in the elections and just being aligned. At this point, even as a poll watcher working on behalf of a candidate, look, there are going to be a lot of recount situations, and those recounts require quick action and quick support from candidates. And that calls into question, is a candidate, what is their legal strategy? Are they going to have the necessary funding? Are they going to need volunteers to help? Just stay close and stay engaged. You never know. And it goes so quickly. And so you need to be on the battlefield already, ready to help support in the case that something goes to a recount. You need to have lots of willing hearts and hands there ready. More broadly speaking, I don't really know the full balance of Republican versus Democrat on the legal front. I know that the Trump campaign has been doing a lot with regard to trying to sue, or I shouldn't say trying to sue, but trying to hold the line and sue where appropriate. They don't, they're not leading with lawsuits as the left is. But one thing I think we know about President Trump is he's a fighter, and he is not going to just, shrug his shoulders and concede. And so I would expect that there will be if it's necessary, and I hope it is not, but if it is necessary, I would expect that there would be a very robust pushback if that's, you know, where this leads, from the Trump campaign to help ensure that this process is fair. And there are a lot of problems that we're already seeing, you know, begin to mount up. But I have full hope that they're going to fight hard.
Thank you. Someone is also asking, regarding voting machines, is there any concern about voting machines being purchased from overseas vendors and then other stakeholders, like potentially George Soros having stake in some of these companies? Is there any influence in that fashion?
Well, look, there's a lot of problems. I mean, again, I'm just going to be honest. If everybody listening to this podcast or this webinar and all of their community of friends could all be involved in elections, it wouldn't be enough to help the shortfall of volunteers and broad awareness that needs to be brought to these kinds of issues. So, okay, to answer your question about voting machines, the process or the equipment falls into a number of different categories, from being antiquated and so old that you're having problems, so old that when they fail in the field, they can't even be fixed, to newer systems that in some instances do have questionable accuracies or questionable firewalls and safeguards built into them. Hart Intercivic, ES&S are two of the manufacturers that have been on record as saying that there are problems within the systems. The roll up to the central tabulation, which does happen, you know, in the clouds. So even though many would like us to believe that this all happens very locally, even though the equipment itself isn't communicating necessarily, the overarching collection of electronic poll books and the way all the votes roll up to a central count electronically, any of that can be hacked. It's being watched very, very closely. The federal government has done a lot in the last 4 years to help prevent subversion, but it's not foolproof, that's for sure.
Thank you. One question. Someone would like to know, it seems as if you're hoping that 2021 will be a time for conservative groups and individuals to realize the magnitude of the problem and start utilizing groups like True the Vote to create a groundswell of activity that we can use to promote a better situation in the future. And so what they'd like to know, does True the Vote have any sort of brochure that we can purchase on their website that we can use to inform people who don't realize how bad the situation is, so that we can share the news in an easier format?
You know, that's a great question. And we don't have a brochure to speak of, but you know, that's a great, not only a great question, it's a great idea, and we really should. We have been talking internally about when the appropriate time is to begin looking towards that 2021 call to action, because we do have to get out of the blocks quickly with supporting a broader conversation, because it's going to take time to fix some of these issues. So I tell you what, I commit to you guys, I commit to this group that we will get something up there that you can use for talking points to spread the word about the value of getting involved.
Thank you. Thank you. That you've inspired some people strongly, so we're very, very appreciative of your time. We have one more question, and it's the one we'd like to ask most speakers for our webinars. What books are you reading lately, or what books do you find on this topic that can be helpful to help people engage more or learn is what they need to learn?
Oh gosh, total honest answer right now, I am doing my level best to keep up with the headlines and with the ever-changing election standards, but I can give you some good go-tos for election standards, a good collection of process and a lot of the granular detail of elections. There's a great website out there called ncsl.org, ncsl.org, that does a great job of collecting data. I think that, gosh, what books am I reading? I mean, the truth is, I'm reading election material and the Bible. I am deep off in understanding what God's hand has, or trying to understand what God's plan is and hand is in these times, because there's, you know, as confusing as things are, there is a plan and there is a faith that overarches what we are seeing, and has has long been anticipated. And so trying to, again, separate the signal and the noise is what I'm focusing on.
Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate the honest answer there, and we appreciate your hard work in establishing this group and providing us with options. It's clear that options are needed. So I hope that everyone who has attended today was completely inspired to become, as she said, to vote and to engage early and work with local candidates so that you can attempt to be a positive influence in this rough election year that we're already experiencing. So thank you so much, Katherine, for your time today and for your wisdom. And we hope everyone would go to her website, True the Vote, and find good ways to be engaged in your local communities.